U.S. Homeland Security officials have been warning that chances for increased violence and threats of domestic terrorism are steadily increasing, citing a volatile and pervasive convergence of disinformation, conspiracy theories, and growing tensions stemming from the economic and political discourse across a broad ideological spectrum. As our world changes, the threats to our national security are, of course, adapting and evolving to reflect the current times. A Department of Homeland Security official, speaking on the condition of anonymity, briefed reporters saying that we are seeing more kinds of actors, different types of actors that have different personal or ideological grievances respond to events that we have not seen in the past. So, what are the most prevalent and new threats that America must contend with? Well, federal agencies that include the Departments of Defense, State, and Homeland Security, as well as the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, have identified an extensive list of long-range emergent threats. These threats fall under four broad categories. The first, foreign adversaries' political and military developments. The second, dual-use technologies. Third, new weapons. And fourth, climate-related events, and of course, demographic changes. Now, I want to take a quick look at these categories and look at some examples of our government's concerns. First, let's go ahead and summarize the threat of foreign adversaries' political and military developments. America's enemies are, of course, developing new political, economic, and military strategies to advance their interests and, of course, challenge America's global hegemony. China, for instance, is working to marshal its diplomatic, economic, and military might to, of course, facilitate its rise as a regional and global power, which could soon challenge access to air, space, cyberspace, and maritime domains. China's increasing competencies in cyberspace and electronic warfare also pose unique threats to U.S. infrastructure. Likewise, Russia is rapidly flexing its muscles across multiple domains, further increasing its capacity to challenge the United States, including waging its own computer-based energy attacks against America's military assets. Next on the list, dual-use technology that has been developed by either the public or private sectors for benign purposes, but when in the wrong hands, can be used to inflict harm. Biotechnology, for example, can be used to alter genes or modify the DNA of plants, animals, and even humans. These efforts could vastly enhance the performance of military assets, or even be used to engineer new chemical and biological weapons. Another pressing concern is the latest technological advances in weaponry, which are changing the landscape of modern warfare. China and Russia are both pursuing investments in hypersonic weapons. These weapons can exceed 5 times the speed of sound, and because of their speed, altitude, and maneuverability, such weapons may even be able to defeat most missile defense systems. And of course, they improve long-range strike capabilities. And finally, climate and demographic changes could also lead to new dangers to America's homeland security. Environmental crises, global warming, and of course just general demographic shifts, these all pose unique challenges that could threaten regional stability, undermine governments, and even strain the ability of military and civilian resources to respond. Extreme weather events could intensify and affect food security, energy, and of course the healthcare sector. For instance, diminishing permafrost is likely to increase habitats for disease-causing pathogens, or unleash ancient viruses and pandemics for which we have no adequate response. With these emerging threats, of course, come additional challenges and consequences for global and domestic security. Already, democracy is undergoing a rapid decline throughout the world as right-wing governments and authoritarianism take hold, all of which are causing problems which have even crept into the political landscape, that's right, of America. But as alarming as these outside threats might be, we must also acknowledge the frequent attacks on America from within its own borders. Domestic terrorism has always existed, but it has been steadily on the rise in America. Most recently, Republicans, for instance, have fanned the flames of civil war with increasingly seditious rhetoric. This comes following the FBI raid on former President Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence. On August 11th, a right-wing extremist attempted to attack a Cincinnati field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, allegedly posting a detailed account of the attack on Donald Trump's Truth Social, which encouraged other users of the social platform to prepare for a, quote, revolutionary type war, end quote. Republican lawmakers have used targeted rhetoric and quite suggestive language to lob attacks on the integrity of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which reasonable people have rightly interpreted as veiled calls for violence in response to the raid. Right-wing extremism has long been the single greatest threat to Homeland Security. And let me go ahead and just cite a few examples of right-wing domestic terrorism from further back in America's all too still recent history. Back on June 3rd, 2020, federal authorities arrested 3 individuals allegedly associated with the Boogaloo movement, a loosely organized group of extremists preparing for a civil war, for conspiring to cause violence in Las Vegas and possessing an improvised incendiary device. Not much less than a week later, law enforcement officials near Richmond, Virginia, arrested Harry H. Rogers, a member of the Ku Klux Klan, for driving a vehicle into peaceful protesters. And around the same time, members of a Brooklyn anarchist group urged its supporters to conduct, quote, rebellion, end quote, against the federal government. These are just some recent examples. A comprehensive analysis by the Bipartisan Center for Strategic and International Studies report that far-right terrorism has significantly outpaced all other terrorist threats by other groups, and that right-wing attacks and plots account for the majority of all terrorist incidents in the United States since 1994, and the total number of right-wing attacks and plots has grown significantly. With the upcoming midterms and a fast-approaching presidential election, the threats of violence and terrorism by the right wing and other groups is certain to grow. While Americans enjoy freedom of speech, and believe me, I'm a firm defender of these rights, and don't believe that these rights should be withheld from anyone, when high-profile figures, and especially politicians and media pundits, engage in violent rhetoric and innuendos that are intended to incite attacks, I'm sorry, but they must be held accountable. Some of the statements made by right-wing politicians leave little to the imagination and could rightfully be considered direct calls to arms and sedition. Democrats and the justice officials should not be cowardice in their response and should make an example of those using their position and platforms to incite violence. That, my friends, is the final word up front. I'm Sean Sainhart, and this is Coup Save America. Please be sure to click that like button if you're watching this, and don't forget, subscribe to our podcasting channel. You can visit our website for links to our various platforms at www.coupsaveamerica.com. Today, I will be joined by Brent Giannotta. I'm sure I massacred that name. He is a former counterterrorism analyst with the Central Intelligence Agency who has in-depth knowledge in Middle Eastern studies and has worked to combat the threat of ISIS foreign fighters and other external attack cadres throughout Iraq and Syria. Brent is also working on a new book that posits how infusing human morality into policymaking will help build a better country and a more prosperous world. Brent joins us right after the break. Be right back. And joining me now, there we go, is Brent. I'm terrible at these names, folks. Welcome, Brent.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. There's a lot of things that I want to discuss with you, but before we get started, I want to just talk about some of the recent events that have taken place. As I mentioned in the monologue, we had the attack on the FBI yesterday. We've got the raid on Donald Trump's residence that people are posturing has nuclear implications. I know that you're from the CIA, not from the FBI, but I do want to get your perceptions and perspective on how all of this relates to our national security here at home.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say you laid out the landscape extremely well in your intro. That domestic terrorism has been the biggest terrorism threat in the United States for a long time, and most people wouldn't feel that, especially when Al Qaeda was on the front page of the newspapers and ISIS was on the front page of the newspapers when I was at the CIA around 2012 through 2015. But it is, and it's even a bigger threat now because of a whole host of issues. One is the internet. The internet is this new medium that operates in a very different way than what we're used to. It operates differently than radio, television, and newspapers. And so when I was analyzing ISIS fighters, the thing we didn't want them to get was safe haven. So famously with Al Qaeda, they were able to go to Afghanistan and the Taliban gave them safe haven there. And when they had that time to come together in safety, they were able to plan. And that's when the worst attacks happened in East Africa and Kenya and Tanzania. The coal bombing off the coast of Yemen in 2000, then, of course, the 9/11 attacks. That happened because there was safe haven. They were not on the run. They had a place that gave them safe harbor, and they can all come together and they could trade propaganda with each other and plan and plot. So I watched ISIS do the same thing from Syria. So now they had an advanced internet at that point, and they had this propaganda they were kicking out on YouTube and all over the internet. And 40,000 people around the world were falling down YouTube rabbit holes, watching ISIS propaganda and deciding this is what I need to do with my life because my life here in France or Australia is not going the way I want to. And the way to give my life meaning is to do this, is to take myself from what we say the fringe of society to the center of world events. And that brought 40,000 people, way more than Al Qaeda ever got, because they didn't have the mature internet nor the propaganda arm that ISIS had. Okay, so now we come to right now. The domestic internet here in the United States, where the internet started, is the most mature anywhere in the world. We have no lack of tech platforms where we can talk, we can post videos, we can trade propaganda. And so we are giving domestic terrorists, who've always been the biggest threat here, the tools that Al Qaeda had and then ISIS used to devastating effects. They're able to see propaganda repetitively over and over and over again in the middle of the night on YouTube or whatever video sharing platforms they're on, and to find each other and to come together and to plot. And so it's always been bad. It's always been a big danger. It has never been bigger than it is now.
Well, that kind of brings up another problem, which is the issue of censorship and how it comes to free speech. And, I tend to be a free speech absolutionist in a certain sense, but I also understand that there's a unique threat posed. I tend to think that a lot of this how much of this propaganda, though, starts with the politician and the media pundits that are kind of adding to this culture of misinformation?
Mm-hmm. They're a big part of it, but I think they're a bit downstream from the original problems. So I think if all the politicians vanished tomorrow, I think we'd still have this problem because there would be levers of power that people always want in a society, and people who feel that their life isn't going the way they want to. The way to change things and to feel like their life has meaning is to push society in the direction that they want, and give themselves power and feel great and feel adulation and feel like people respect them and look up to them. So that's never going away. But these politicians I see them being very reactive. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, the Democratic platform is when they test in surveys is far more popular than the Republican platform. Yet the weights of power seem to be either even, or they don't seem to bear that out as far as the distribution of power. And that's because many politicians are being reactive to the accounts and the voices on Twitter much more than their own constituents. And of course, Twitter self selects for the most radical voices. And so it feels as though our politics is reflecting a much more radical and much more fringe element from our politics than actually exists. So they're
Right.
absolutely fanning the flames and spraying gasoline on the fire. But I mean, they aren't coming up with a lot of the propaganda. It's being fed to them through a lot of other media entities and provocateurs who are being opportunistic, using the internet to get rich, get famous, get clicks, get adulation. But it's all this horrible, and around we go.
Now, we've been told that, and I don't dispute this, that foreign actors like Russia and China and so forth are sort of adding to this culture of misinformation and chaos. And again, I don't dispute that, but what I do see is there is, and I'm going to go back to the politicians for just a moment. As you say, at the very least, they're reactive to this stuff. And I see this on both sides, but mostly the right wing. And the hypocrisy almost just seems staggering. People seem to be willing to believe whatever narrative fits the circumstances in the moment. When we're talking about Hunter Biden and the FBI, the right wing tends to cheer. Then all of a sudden, a search warrant is executed on Donald Trump's property, and suddenly it's defund the FBI. And Rand Paul was on one of the news programs the other day talking about how do we know the FBI is not planting evidence? How do we know we can trust them? As if this is all come out of the blue. But we never heard this when it comes to Hunter Biden or when it comes to like, for instance, Hillary Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
And it really does seem like some of these politicians and some of the statements that they've made in response to the raid seem awfully seditious and close to calls to arms. Lauren Boebert, I believe, tweeted a quote, I think, from Thomas Jefferson that basically said, something about tyranny, and the response to tyranny is to rise up against it. And then, of course, you see these attacks on the FBI yesterday. Part of it, I think, is that people feel disenfranchised. I mean, I think people on the left and right have been screwed over by the political system that we have. There's economic, there's social issues. And I think what you said about ISIS is kind of true. People do feel disconnected and they feel themselves reactive. And yet we've got the media pundits and politicians edging this on. And from January 6th, I mean, you would think that people would have kind of learned their lesson. Where do you, I'm quite scared. I mean, we're going into the midterms. The question as to whether or not either side is going to accept the election results. It's a presidential election that's coming up pretty quickly. Do you see a civil war breaking out or something along those lines?
I don't. I'm more optimistic on this point than a lot of people are. It doesn't, I don't know, I don't see it happening for a number of reasons. One is that the current state of right-wing militias and the people who would probably be starting the charge of a civil war, I see them psychologically as benefiting far more from the camaraderie they're gaining by being together and being angry together than actually killing FBI agents or storming, I don't know, the Pentagon or something like that. They would have to fight against the largest military that human history has ever put together. I don't see how that's a fair fight, or how state police or federal agents wouldn't be able to deal with them in the way that this guy in Cincinnati was dealt with. I think that their bark is much louder than their bite. And there's going to be one-offs, and there's going to be small plots that make it dangerously close to being executed. And those are dangerous and scary, and they should be dealt with seriously. But a full civil war, I mean, that would mean them fighting the military or fighting every liberal that they find. And like I hadn't planned on buying a firearm to defend myself or to go attack somebody. I don't think you had either, and
No.
no one I know has planned that either. It doesn't. Civil wars happen. They're very sad, and they're usually the most bloody and fatal of wars out there. But I don't see it happening for that one reason. Another reason is that during the 2020 election, the system held because we have this, what I like to call a connective tissue that is sort of holding our democracy together. People stepped up to make sure that the election wasn't stolen, and they were mostly election officials in swing states and a lot of other brave people around in and around the White House who, they were done. They couldn't take the extra step that only Donald Trump was willing to take, including his family. And I think that that innate love for democracy and fairness still lives deep within most people in this country, and that in the midterms coming up and then the next presidential election, there's going to be more connective tissue. It's going to kick in even before that. And I think we're going to see it from the Department of Justice vis-a-vis these court problems that Trump has right now, and state attorneys general, the same reason. And I think this is going to kick in again. I think that extreme politics in the United States has a way of snapping back on people who do egregious things. I think we're watching the snapback happen to Trump. It's not happening as fast as anybody wants it to, but it is happening. And you give this another year, and it could look really crazy. It could look really great for the Democratic Party that he is out of the picture. And I think that even if, for example, Ohio completely takes free and fair elections away, I think that will snap back. The liberal loving people in Ohio will snap back, and that the Department of Justice will get involved, and that will be fixed. And maybe this is wishful thinking. That's probably what it sounds like to a lot of people. But I still have a lot of faith in the democratic experiment here.
Well, to push back on a little bit, we see a lot of gerrymandering going on that could impact. So let's say that Republicans, because we're seeing a lot of far-right candidates that are even scarier than Donald Trump in many regards. I mean, they're certainly on Team MAGA. If they were to, say, secure a victory in the midterms and change that system and make sure that the mistakes that happened in 2020 that prevented the election from being overturned did not occur, I get what you're saying about the average citizen, standing up for democracy and having this resolve. But we're separate from that bigger system. If you've got election officials that are willing to surrender to a despot, I don't know. Should we at this point trust the courts to intercede? It seems as though the system is breaking down pretty rapidly, and it's just being held together by very, loose strings.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. A lot of these far-right MAGA figures have won their primary, but it doesn't mean they're going to win in the general election in November. And a lot of people that I listen to who know politics a lot better than I do are very hopeful and confident that they won't. So there's one thing. Should we trust the courts? It's a really good question. I'm heartened by what happened during Donald Trump's 61 attempts to overturn elections in swing states, that 60 of them held, that his win percentage was almost zero. And I hope that will increase as the Biden appointed judges take their seats. I think that, and I'm not a lawyer and I don't know all the nitty gritty, but I think that the Department of Justice has some power to contest some horrible things that if one of these MAGA candidates takes power as an election official or a state attorney general or a governor, that they can come in and challenge that legally. So those things also give me some hope.
Do you see the Democratic Party being aggressive enough in going after it? Because it seems as though they've acted almost in a sort of complicity, and they're willing to kind of be, I'll just use the word cowardice for lack of a better term. You know, here's my worry. Let's say that they were to arrest Donald Trump, or let's just even talk about the raid that happened. That is very likely to intensify, increase, these hardcore Republicans to come out and vote even harder in the midterms. If they were to try to prosecute Trump, I imagine that we would see more acts of domestic terrorism rise up. And again, that would mobilize the base. So it almost seems like we're in a no-win here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could happen. So I have an analogy from Syria. When ISIS was hit by, when ISIS lost a battle, either to the Syrian military or to an attack by US forces, it would have an effect among supporters around the world. And what we saw was that it was usually half and half, that it inspired a certain amount of people to run towards Syria because they need us. And it inspired an equal amount of people to say, well, they're getting their ass kicked, so this fight isn't for me anymore. I only want to back a winner. I want to have that be another point of confidence that some people who voted for Donald Trump are going to look at this raid and be like, this guy is so much more of a liability than I ever thought or wanted him to be. And I don't want this type of chaos getting back into the White House. I mean, fingers crossed. I think that could be the case here too.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems is that we have been too afraid as a nation to hold our politicians criminally accountable. And I think that that's contributed to this current situation here, where, and again, executive authority has been expanded increasingly as well. So I hope you're right. I hope that we see the system hold. Now, similarly, what are the chances of foreign actors taking advantage of this chaos and political instability that we're experiencing? Mm-hmm. I imagine that's probably on the radar.
It's always on the radar, of course. Again, I will be confident and hopeful about this too. One reason is that I've already done this. We've already been through this. The threat is extremely well known to normal people and to everybody in the government. I mean, this threat is fully centrally on the radar. I know that the Washington Post published a story after the midterms, 2018, where the Pentagon Cyber Command launched an attack on all the troll farms in St. Petersburg to make sure that they didn't mess with the midterm election. That is a capability that I don't think most Americans knew that we would deploy as a country. And that to me means that we are able to do more than we assume. And that maybe there haven't been more attacks like that because we haven't needed them. Smart people who I really respect go on podcasts, and who know more than I do, they say that the threat from outside the country is nothing compared to the threat inside the country, vis-a-vis propaganda, calls to violence, and things like that. So Russia and China can try all they want, but it seems that citizens who are right here, right now, have a stronger hand to play in that realm.
So you bring up an interesting point that I do want to get to, which is the United States, the Pentagon waging those attacks against the troll farms in Russia. Just recently, the FBI revealed a assassination plot against John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. And this was in retaliation to an assassination that we had engaged in overseas. How much of what we do kind of comes back at us? I condemn drone attacks, these things which I think cultivate to a climate of terrorism. And I understand the need to defend our country, and I understand that there sometimes are proactive measures that need to be taken. But it does seem like we go to the extremes. And how much of that increases the threat to the United States, do you think?
Yeah, I think that our, well, I'm not supposed to talk about aerial attacks, but I would say that there has been, during the global war on terror, it felt as though the US government was overly zealous. And I think there's definitive evidence that that zealotry, that over aggression, did inspire a lot of people to either take up arms against the United States or to be anti American just sort of by default. And in every town and village, it was assumed you were anti American because of that horrible thing that happened last week or last year. And that's just human nature. And so back then, there was a cost benefit analysis being made. And it felt to me as though we were treating every potential terrorist suspect as the possible next Osama bin Laden, which is insane because 9/11 was such a black swan event that needed 1,000 things to go right. And so that just wasn't going to be the case at all. But we acted as though we had this unlimited mandate. As long as somebody sort of
Right.
sniffed of, potential wrongdoing, we could take the ultimate strike against this person. And this gets to the crux of my book, which I'm really flattered that you brought up. Empathy is seeing yourself in somebody else and treating them accordingly. And we did not do that for these people in the Middle East and across the Islamic world, at least for multiple decades we didn't. You brought up that these people that are really drawn to this extremist violent action, they feel put out by the system, by finances, by they can't make enough money to live comfortably. Everybody now in the United States knows what this feels like.
Yeah.
Not everybody. Most of us do. And especially Muslims growing up in Europe, who were the people that I studied and tracked the most. Of course they did. Their parents immigrated from places like North Africa, Middle East. They value education. They put them into good schools and they got degrees in computer science. They couldn't get a job. Maybe they didn't know how to navigate the system in France or Belgium or England, or they were discriminated against. That also could have happened too. Either way, it doesn't matter how, they popped into their mid-20s and they didn't like their life. And so that's what drew them to these places. So in sum, you're absolutely right. The United States has a gigantic gun. And during the global war on terror, especially in the beginning, we used it too much. We didn't apply a whole of government policy that incorporated the idea that these are human beings and we can affect them in much more ways than just letting them live or letting them die. We can ramp up diplomacy and economic development programs 2, 3, 4x just with money and a little more, a little more ingenuity. And
Right.
that can make lives a lot better for these people. And then suddenly our national security problems go way down.
But sometimes it seems as though and another problem that we have in America is, of course, the largesse of corporations and special interests, the military industrial complex, for instance. There's a lot of money to be made in these conflicts, in these wars, and they have a lot of influence on our political system. And it just seems as though that big gun is being used more and more, as opposed to, and the American people too almost seem to demand the big guns be used. I mean, when you talk about social programs within the United States that would help people, you have a lot of opposition to these measures. People want to be tough on crime, for instance, not understanding that there's other long-term measures that can be taken. And so I think a lot of it is, again, I'm going to go back to what you said earlier, reactive. We got politicians and people that are reacting to situations. How do we counter this influence? How do we combat money? How do we create more empathy, basically, among the electorate and get back control from these special interests in this small faction of corporations?
Well, first thing is you have to buy my book. So that's number one.
Well, you got to release it. When's it coming out?
I don't know. It's so slow. It's a black
Right.
box to me. I'm not sure, but I will let you know. And thank you for even referencing it. So I'm not I'm not a guy who does this type of politics. I did, national security. I did an internship on Capitol Hill, so I know somebody who reads the newspaper every day. But I would say, if I sort of had a magic wand, the first thing I would do is clean up the internet, specifically social media and digital media. Again, if you read stuff by Tristan Harris and Daniel Schmachtenberger, who are working to try to figure out how we clean up the internet, I mean, fake news travels 6 times faster than true news. And that's bad because repetition is the easiest way to convince a human to change their minds about something. So as long as garbage is circulating through the internet, which started here, and all the tech firms are based here, then people are going to vote against their interests because they're going to want a media sensation and a cultural warrior more than someone who will deliver them legislation and financial assistance that'll make their lives better. It's just like how we are as tribal species, right? So that's the first thing. And then,
Well, hold on just a minute, though.
yeah.
How do you do that while preserving freedom of speech? And, and how do you, when we talk about fake news, again, I understand what you're saying with fake news. At the same time, there have been times when the mainstream media has gotten headlines disastrously wrong. And people that, when a lot of people that champion, I'm not saying that you are, but a lot of people that champion for the censorship and the cancel culture that we sort of see, will, my response to them is, well, but what if those people that had countered some of the mainstream narratives in the past that turned out to be false or wrong, they would have been banned? So that seems like a rabbit hole as well. How do you see balancing that?
Yeah. So I will appeal to you that I'm not a free speech absolutist, and I don't think we should be. So everybody knows the analogy of yelling fire in a crowded theater and then people get trampled to death, and that we should restrict that type of speech. Of course, yelling fire is not the same type of speech as expressing your political views online. It feels different. It feels, if you were canceled online, it would feel more of a violation. However, the freedom of speech is in the First Amendment of the Constitution. And before the First Amendment, there's a preamble which says that we need to provide for the common defense and provide life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And if someone's free speech encroaches on that, then there's mandate to consider whether it should be restricted. And so I think we've all seen that speech online can have devastating effects. I mean, there's research that suicide among young girls is sort of like hockey sticking up and to the right, and that it's probably because of these girls doing comparisons of like unattainable levels of beauty that they're seeing online, or they're being bullied, or they're being, sexploitation, or tons of other things. This feels way more dangerous than yelling fire in a theater. And so for that reason, I can't be a First Amendment absolutist. I think there needs to be maybe not full censorship, but something. Like we need to clean this up somehow.
But it does seem as though that opens the door to a sort of authoritarianism where more, again, when you open that door, you tend to see actors come in to get it, move in there. And some of the things on social media that I've seen, people being canceled or banned, are very benign. Their opinions, for instance, about COVID. I don't agree with those opinions. I don't agree with their assessments, but I support their right to say them and to question, for instance, the vaccine manufacturers. And people are being canceled for that, or having their account suspended, or being flagged. So I understand. Believe me, when Donald Trump was banned from Twitter, I was shamefully excited about that. Mm-hmm. But we see the flip side of that, where that sort of feeds into that culture of victimization that his supporters also feel. Mm-hmm. And they're going to find another space, whether it's Truth Social or whatever the hell it's called, or they're going to be reactive. It just seems like a slippery slope to me, in terms of who's the arbiter of what's true and what's not true. So I get what you're saying about the need to maybe not be absolutist on free speech, but I do worry about who's going to be the arbiter of that. Because right now we see a power vacuum occurring on social media where it's tending to kind of come back on the left.
Yeah, I understand that. So I would say that the United States has successfully in the past many times decided what type of messaging is acceptable and not acceptable without resorting to authoritarianism. There's a great book by Jonathan Rauch at Brookings Institution called The Constitution of Knowledge. And the book explains how different mediums evolve. They started out pretty like garbage, like a lot of bad stuff, like newspapers, radio started out bad, and then organically matured to a better, much more civil type of back and forth. So newspapers in the United States, at least, I read that in the 1700s, they were basically a mouthpiece of political parties.
Oh, yeah.
They were fully partisan, right? And so no one's going to say they're not partisan now, but I don't know, I wouldn't say that necessarily that the LA Times is a mouthpiece of the Democratic Party. I would say there's enough separation there that I can believe that when they say something is true, that it is, or at least they tried to make sure that it was true as they could. I would also say that up until very recently, we as citizens took for granted what is taught in schools. We never really thought too much about how are they teaching history. Now we do, but we didn't. We just sort of assumed that it was all fine. And if they missed a few things, no big deal. They're going to get it basically right because there is a process to approving textbooks and things like this. The internet is throwing all this into disarray, but there is an argument that if we apply some bureaucratic pressure to this, that we can get it to a place where everybody kind of agrees about what is right and what is wrong, to move the Overton window to a place where most people are comfortable with it.
It seems to me that one of the chief problems here, and you kind of touched upon that, is ignorance, education, and knowledge. One problem is that you've got people that are basically busy and distracted. They don't have time to do their own research. They don't have time to consume regular news, let alone, a variety of news sources. And then there is the tribalism that occurs. It seems as though if we don't address those fundamental issues, any efforts to curb the tide of disinformation and the conspiracy theories and the echo chambers, basically, that we see are going to be futile. And so I would say that without major social change in our entire structure, including education and economics, and I don't see those changes being advocated in either party, really. I mean, it seems we're stuck in this neoliberal mentality. Wages have not increased. We've got a recession for all intents and purposes. I worry about climate change, the effect that's going to have. We've got a lot of challenges, and I don't see politicians on either side going. It's almost like our house is literally on fire, and they're just throwing sprinkles at us. Little dabs of water, and it's very frustrating. And all of that, I think, feeds into this climate of disinformation and these culture wars that we're seeing. Because it's just, again, people don't have the time to do their own research or to even consume the news. So I would like to think that if we had more education and if we had more awareness and if we were more honest in terms of especially the media, we tend to have this rosy picture. We tend to always portray America as the good guy when that's not always necessarily the case. We're not objective in even analyzing our own system of economics, right? I mean, we just assume that we're the best in the world. America's great, or used to be great, and we can return to that American exceptionalism. Don't you think that we need to be more critical of ourselves and be willing to say, hey, America has flaws, and the way to move forward is to improve upon those flaws. But we can't improve upon them if we don't acknowledge them.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. In the Democratic Party, we have a gerontocracy. If you look at Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, Chuck Schumer, I mean, they don't know how the internet works, and I don't blame them because they were born 400 years ago. Okay. I just went to about a month ago. I went to a meeting with Abigail Spanberger, and Alyssa Slotkin, two brand new Democratic representatives from Virginia and Michigan, and they both worked in national security with me. We didn't overlap. We didn't know any of the same people, but we were doing generally the same stuff around the same time. And they are very, very frustrated with the leadership. They told us that the leadership, they got to where they are doing a certain thing, and that the world has changed, yet they refuse to do things any other way, and they refuse to hear new voices. I am endlessly sympathetic to that, and I think this makes sense to people who pay attention to things.
Oh, absolutely.
All this to say, I have a lot of hope in the new generation. I got really lucky to volunteer on the AOC campaign for a year before she won. And the energy that she brought was something brand new that no one had ever seen before. I think she gets it. And one thing that they get, and I love that they get, is they understand that mental health and people's psychological situation is really, really important to pretty much everything. Their finances, their education. How do you learn if you are so angsty inside, right? So the gerontocracy doesn't put as much stock into this as they should. But I am hopeful, even I dare say a little confident, that once the new generation starts taking the reins of power in our political party, we are going to change the conversation. And we can't forget that politics sits downstream of culture. And that means that they reflect what we do. So it is kind of all on us to change the conversation. We've got to all get educated, find people who are like-minded, and then share the information that we all need to know, band together, because there's strength in numbers. And I don't think, to your point, we're not going to fix our country any other way. There just isn't any other way to do it. Come together, get smart, be empathetic, know how the levers of power move, and then move them.
Well, and the largest voting bloc in America are the non-voters. And when you dig into that, you find that a lot of it is they just do not feel, and this is justified in many circumstances, that the government does not represent them. It doesn't matter how they vote. If you look at Michigan, for instance, you had a lot of people that voted for Obama who decided that, especially after the Flint, Michigan fiasco, that they either decided to vote for Trump or they just didn't bother to show up at the polls at all. So again, we seem to be in this catch-22 here, where in order to get change, we have to get people to vote, and yet they don't see a lot of incentive in doing that because the system does not seem to be changing. As far as AOC and the so-called the squad, as they're called, do you think that they've done enough? Because it seems as though I had a lot of hope and was very excited, but I wish they were more aggressive. I wish that they were doing more and using their power more as a block to sort of, because they have a lot of power if they were to come together. And it seems as though I don't know, maybe they're playing the long game. I get that once you're in that system, things do change, and there are challenges that the rest of the public are not aware of.
Yep.
To say that they haven't been disappointing on a number of issues would be disingenuous of me, but at the same time, I want to believe what you're saying. I do think that the next generation is on the right track. The question is whether or not they have the power and how we get them into power. Because again, we get corporations and special interests that are dare I say, buying elections in many cases. I mean, we've seen that with progressives that are running here in the midterms. It does seem like an uphill battle sometimes. And it goes back to the narrative, I guess, too. I mean, back to what you say on social media. I mean, people do not have time to do their own research, and so they trust what the mainstream media says, or they go on Twitter and Facebook and they're getting a lot of information that's not accurate. I mean, it's mind-blowing the number of issues that we're facing and the complexity of the problems.
Yeah, you're right.
So
So
again, tell us the solution. I know that it's going to be in your book, but
yeah, I've got all the answers. Don't worry.
got all the answers.
So the squad has one really bad thing going for them, is that they are the perfect boogeyman for the right, right?
And the left too.
And the left too.
Yeah.
With the right-wing media has taken their stance, or what they presume the squad stance to be, on cultural issues, and blown it up to a cartoonish degree. And it gets spread around the internet, repetition. People start to believe that that is actually what the squad believes. And maybe sometimes it's true, but a lot of times it isn't. And then what happens is there's like a feedback loop where other members of the Democratic Party also use the squad as a boogeyman to reinforce their own moderate, level-headed bona fides with their constituents and with the wider mainstream media. Okay, so now the squad is getting it from both sides. So that is something that is unfortunate for them. They need to overcome that, and they haven't done that. That's where the disappointment is. They've leaned into those cultural issues, and they haven't leaned into the non-cultural issues, which is where they have the best ideas. Things like universal health care, getting money out of politics, like lobbying, gerrymandering. These things are actually extremely popular and extremely effective. They need a marketing department, and I'm happy to sign up if you are. We can both write this stuff for them. Because these are the right ideas.
But I think that they know this, though.
I hope so. I mean, they're also young. I mean, they haven't been in the game very long, right? Political messaging is extremely hard, and it's even harder now because the internet has kind of changed the game a lot. And so, yes, the Democrats are not aggressive enough. They don't play as dirty as the Republicans do. There's a great argument, or a great debate to have, whether they should or not. I think there's good arguments on both sides. It's just really tough, and you never know what's going to work until something does work. And once you do, you put that lightning in a bottle and then you repackage it. There's a lot of good messaging going on. There's a lot of crappy messaging going on, and a lot of messengers are still in their chair, even though they shouldn't be anymore, because they don't resonate.
One of the things that truly, truly inspired me in 2016 was Bernie Sanders' campaign. And part of what was inspiring is because up to that point, I had a perception of America, or the American people, as being opposed to a lot of these progressive mandates, not getting it, not understanding. And Bernie Sanders brought together a coalition of people that were both Democrats and Republicans, which was pretty amazing. And when you looked at the people attending his rallies, and you looked at the messaging, and you looked at the level of support that he was generating, and the solidarity, I had so much hope. And then, of course, it kind of fizzled out. And then it kind of had a resurgence again in 2020. And then, of course, that sort of, again, fizzled out. Does that not create more problems for the progressive movement? This feeling of malaise that sort of exists, this feeling of like, well, every time we get close, it just fails. And how do we overcome that?
Oh, man. Well, Bernie, he had the right idea, but he had a few fatal flaws. Obviously, he was very clumsy on his messaging around race. Not that he was wrong, he was just clumsy. And nowadays, if you're just a little bit clumsy, it can mean life or death. There is the sense that people were gauging whether, okay, so he's fine now, but 8 years from now, he's going to be how many years old, and would I trust him then, being with possible senility and things like that. So he did get close. I mean, he tied for the Iowa caucus, right? Like he like tied winning that thing. And this is before all Democratic voters had figured out what all other Democratic voters were going to vote. Now, it wasn't until South Carolina that Biden won, and Claiborne came out and said that Biden's the guy, and everyone threw up their hands, like, okay, Biden is the person who is electable, so we're all going to vote for him, and that's how he won. Not because he was going to be an amazing president, or because he was a visionary, or because he had a new, like, amazing idea of what America could be and a way to get us there. He didn't really have much of that at all. He was sort
No.
of one of those dolls where he's president, you pull the string, and then he talks like a president. That's pretty much what Biden was
Well, his
and is.
gaffes are pretty problematic.
Yeah. And gaffes have never been more damaging than they are now in the world of social media now. But you asked about, like, where does the progressive movement go? And so we are about to have a midterm election coming up, and then right after, the second it's over, the presidential election of 2024 is going to ramp up. And so there's going to be new blood, there's going to be new energy, because these things always get started. I mean, January, February, we're all going to get a lot more emails and a lot more text messages, and we're going to see a lot more old politicians, new politicians on TV and on YouTube. And you're going to hear about, in your town, these people are getting together and they're canvassing, and people are going to have clipboards as you're walking down the sidewalk. There's going to be this energy, and anybody who's worked on the campaign knows that this energy is real, and it's almost magical. It creates a magical connection between you and your country, and you and your fellow citizen, because you're reaching out to these people. You're saying, hey, like, do you ever think about this issue? Do you want this thing fixed? We have a plan to fix it. And they may not be political at all, but they do want that thing fixed. And suddenly you've got a new voter who wasn't a voter before. The progressive winning strategy is to reach out to new voters, because the problems that progressive policies fix are only getting worse. They're not getting better. There's more money in politics than ever.
Oh, yeah.
Healthcare prices are still ridiculous. And as you brought up before, we as citizens and voters were represented by our representatives less than ever before. I mean, there was this like insane graph where
Oh, yeah, I saw that, I
there was like
think.
a protest. There was a protest here, and then there was a lobbying effort here, and then it showed when legislation changed. And when the protest happened, there was that much change in legislation. When the lobbying effort happened, everything changed. And
Yeah.
that's all you need to see. I don't blame non-voters. I don't blame, like, brand new immigrants for not getting into the political process. But we can change this, and it requires energy. It requires being really smart about how to use the internet and digital media to plug into the hearts and minds of non-voters. And that's all empathy, like seeing yourself in somebody else, understanding what's going to motivate them. That's empathy, and that's a gigantic piece of this puzzle.
And I mean, I think that's what was so inspiring about the Bernie Sanders campaign, is that you saw that, and that was a very key component to his messaging. And well, let me ask you, do you think, I mean, we have this duopoly going on between the Democratic and the Republican parties, and you've got a situation where neither have, again, are really representing the constituents. Is there, I mean, it seems to me that there's a need for at least another party, a third party, something to break up this duopoly. Do you think it's even possible to reform the Democratic Party to progress within there?
Yeah, I think the Democratic Party will progress organically as the 85-year-olds retire and the new blood comes in. I think that is going to, I mean, it's the passage of time. Everything changes. And
But do we have that time? I mean, given all of the crises that we're facing, I mean, it seems to me like we're running out of time, especially on climate change.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if we have enough time. I mean, the new climate legislation, that's a big shot in the arm, you know? It's not everything we want, but it's something. It's the first major piece of climate legislation I think we've ever passed, and that's huge. This is like never happened before, and it just happened. So
Right, but the problem with that is that the outcome is still the same. I mean, yes, it's a step in the right direction,
mhm,
but it also comes with huge handouts to the fossil fuel industry
mhm,
that seem counterproductive at best.
mhm,
Democrats, especially, we hear them say climate change is the crisis. It's an existential threat, and yet they're not acting like it, and that's the problem. I don't believe that they're disingenuous when they say they believe in climate change and the threat,
mhm.
but again, we need radical intervention here, radical action, not these milquetoast sort of policies, and that's where I get scared. I mean, I would,
Yeah.
if you look at it from a sociological perspective, the COVID pandemic was, for all intents and purposes, part of this whole climate crisis as well. I mean, as we're encroaching upon various habitats, different weather events, I mean, we're going to see a lot more pandemics coming. We're going to see a public health crisis, the likes of which we've never seen before,
Mhm,
coming from this climate. And we're seeing it right now.
mhm,
And yet, it just seems as though, and that's where I get very disappointed. It's hard for me to celebrate these steps in the right direction when I'm
mhm,
like, yeah, but if they acknowledge it's a problem, but they're not acting like the house is actually on fire.
mhm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's no better way in politics to hit rock bottom politically, psychologically, than to look at the climate change problem for too long. Um, so I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. It is very depressing, but I don't know. I'm hopeful. Okay, so we need more people to vote Democratic. Not only that, but we need them to believe that the climate science is true and that it is an emergency. And we currently have what 100 million people who don't believe that's the case. And I believe the best way to change their minds is to reform digital media because again, the fake news 6 times faster than true news. If you
Well, we've got
stop,
reality, though. I mean, the heat wave that we're experiencing. I mean, the changing. I mean, it's mind-boggling that
yeah,
people, in this day and age, deny that climate change is a problem and that it's a problem that requires immediate action. I mean, I get that there's propaganda on the internet, but for
mhm.
God's sakes, I mean, go outside. I mean, what do you, it's like, oh, well, there's snow, so therefore climate change can't. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah. Well, when people are psychologically in a bad place, when they don't have the things that they want out of life, they're not making the kind
Right.
of money that makes them comfortable, what are they going to grab onto? They got two choices. They can grab onto truth, what is demonstrably provable, what's around them, or they can grab onto this fantasy that pushes them to be a protagonist in this fake online culture war. And a lot of people pick that because they can't afford a comfortable life because minimum wage hasn't kept up with inflation, and housing prices and education prices and healthcare is all through the roof, and it's going to keep going up. And so, of course, tens more millions of Americans are going to be in just like crappy working poor levels, and so more and more people are going to pick the fantasy. They want the fantasy. They want the Donald Trump carnival barker. They want the election denier. They want the guy who has abused his last two wives and is horrible. They're going to vote and believe everything that that guy says because they want to be able to have that kind of power too. And they're joining this army. I mean, we're a tribal species. Like our neocortex sits on top of a lizard brain that, is reaching for stuff to make us feel better, to hit us with dopamine and make us feel like our life actually matters, that people respect us, that people think we're moral, and that we're part of something bigger than just ourselves. And believing in climate change just doesn't do that for half the people in the country. Reforming social media will help. And the other thing that will help is helping these poor people with their cost of living. Give them a more comfortable life. Don't make them get 3 jobs to make ends meet. And
Exactly.
legislation helps. Biden is making this actually happen. I mean, the COVID relief bill was huge. We cut his relief is going to cut child poverty by 40%. I mean, that's actually real. These are really good things going in the right direction. Our government moves very slowly, but when it does, it's got a really heavy hammer, and it can actually do the things we need to happen here.
Well, on the child poverty issue, it's important to also understand that when we're talking about poverty in that context, we're talking about the federal standards and in some cases the international standards that classify what poverty really is, which I think is completely unrealistic and very minimal. Poverty is a sociocultural problem, and it sounds good messaging, but I would say that child poverty doesn't exist. It's just poverty. And without addressing that problem, and again, I understand what you're saying, and it's a step in the right direction. I just find the message disingenuous because, when we're talking about poverty, it's a lot more than just tax breaks and so forth. Education, we have to invest in education, and we have to make that, more accessible. Same with healthcare. Even with the environment, the cost of living. I mean, if you've got a child in poverty, you've got a family in poverty. And we have to look at the causal roots of poverty. And again, it seems like we never look at the causal roots of these issues. And it's great to say, hey, I passed this, this bill and this tax cut, and where it's technically reducing child poverty. But when that doesn't relate to people, when it doesn't actually impact them to where they can notice it, that's where we have the problem and the disenfranchisement, I think.
Yeah, you're right. And you know this, and there's other organizations that are really deep on this issue, and they know it, but most people don't.
Right.
You're right. That 40% sounds great, but it's probably not having the impact that most of us want it to have. Those are the things that need to get out there. And unfortunately, these nonprofits, and most of them they just don't have the media heft of a super PAC or a corporation, or dark money groups getting money out of politics and uplifting these organizations who actually know the real facts is going to help. This is all changing the conversation in the United States, which regulating social media is going to be a big part of, and elevating people who know this stuff and who care about this stuff. And it sounds insanely hard, and it's just like this gigantic tsunami of a wave to fight against, but there's no other choice but to fight against it. But educating yourself and banding together with other people who are like-minded is the way it starts.
Right, and I was just gonna say, one of the things that and again, social media, I'm guilty of being reactive, and I sometimes will, sometimes you're just in a bad mood and you just need to vent, right? And so social media is a very convenient tool for that. And usually when I catch myself doing that, I go back and I delete the tweet and I apologize to someone. What I try to do on social media, and what I hope to do with the show too, is reach across the aisle and build solidarity where you can. Because once you get to people, and I found this so many times on social media. I mean, I've been in arguments with people on social media, and then all of a sudden I'm just like, wait a minute, you know what? I've made this too personal. I'm not responding, and I apologize. I'm like, you know what? That was wrong of me. I'm sorry. And all of a sudden, that triggers like a human response. And now we're talking. It doesn't happen all the time, but occasionally. And then you start to have a relationship. And I actually just had this happen recently, and the person responded back, yeah, I was an ass. And, we both were. And he said, sometimes it's hard to forget there's a human on the other end of this thing. And I enjoy those opportunities because, when you see a hate message on Twitter or when you see disinformation, I kind of like that because that gives me the opportunity to inform that person. Whereas, silence kind of breeds ignorance, right? I mean, it doesn't provide the opportunity. And so it seems to me that we need to combat a lot of this by and some people use Twitter and Facebook as an echo chamber. They don't engage with people that don't share their beliefs. They don't have those discussions. And that's, again, that does create that echo chamber for things to grow. So I would say that people need to get outside their comfort zones and interact with people that have different opinions. You don't have to agree, but chances are you're going to find things that you do agree on. And when you find disinformation or misinformation, rather than be reactive and insulting and, hey, you're stupid and that's stupid, engage with them with, again, this doesn't always work. And frankly, sometimes it seldom does. People just don't want to hear, or people can. The other thing that you see too is people have their favorite facts. You'll post something from a particular news source and like, oh, well, that's a left. You can't trust that. Yeah, and it seems like anything that you present gets put into this political tribalism. But nonetheless, you do reach people. And even if you're not reaching the person that's the poster, for instance, you might reach people that are not engaging, that are just reading. And I think that is more important than anything. And I think even more than trying to censor a lot of this stuff, it's just engaging. But both sides do have this echo chamber mentality. And again, I get it. Trumpers are evil. But again, when you look at it, there are hardcore Trumpers, but when you look, again, I think you hit it on the nail. What's the reason for that? What are they looking for? They're dissatisfied in their life, and they're looking for someone to fix it. And this leads me to my next question. The decline of democracy across the world. We're seeing a lot more of this strongman mentality creeping in, and the erosion of democracy throughout the world. That is startling and frightening. We've already kind of addressed what sort of feeds into that, but how do we reverse that trend on a global level?
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the way I see it, digital media is to blame for this, because right-wing reactionary political messages travel faster, because they've done brain scans of self-described liberals and self-described conservatives. They put them in the brain scan machine, and then they show them images that are a little bit disgusting or vile or whatever. And you're probably familiar with the science that the visceral reaction from the self-described conservatives are much stronger. And
the disgust response and fear response.
Right. So, you can take this idea and apply it to all sorts of other human behaviors. Jonathan Haidt at NYU, we did a bunch of evolutionary psychology research that showed that conservatives are much more like energetic to be furious against a perceived enemy or somebody who broke the rules. If you know a Republican in your life, you can hear this, and the people need to be punished when they break the rules, right? So if this stuff is circulating the internet faster because it is energizing and mobilizing conservative readers more than liberal readers, then it's going to get to more people, and it's going to tip the balance in a society toward being scared of the immigrants and the refugees that are coming from the Middle East and North Africa, and to be suspicious of new people in our neighborhood. To me, this is completely predictable, that there was going to be a handful of governments that were going to tip, and the democratically elected, the liberal head of state was going to be voted out, and the conservative was going to be elected, and that person was going to tweak the government so that it wasn't really a democracy anymore. This is the Viktor Orban playbook. And so it's happened there, it's happened in Brazil and the Philippines, and almost happened in France and all these other places. And to me, this was completely predictable and totally explainable by how the internet operates and how it interacts with the human psyche. Thankfully, we've had a few years that sort of democracy lovers have caught on to this and are starting to push back. And there's a lot of, good action happening, but it's still going to take a bunch of time. And again, broken record, regulating digital media solves a lot of these problems, including the regression of democracy around the world. Because if you read Freedom House, it started 16 years ago, and that's when like Facebook added the news feed. It's like the year that all these advances happen on social media platforms. The evidence is just all over the place. So there I am again.
So, yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I agree. But I also think that there's a case to be made that the internet serves as a platform for people to be reactive. But again, there's something driving people to that. And a lot of that does come from the socioeconomic conditions that exist, where people do feel frustrated, and people are, when you're struggling to pay rent and put food on the table and so forth, it's very appealing to be able to have somebody to blame for that, whether it's immigrants or a political party. And it just seems like we're creating fertile ground for this type of discontent. And then social media comes along and amplifies that. So again, I think that we need to address the causal roots of, because if people were I don't think that we'd be seeing a lot of this going on if people had their fundamental needs, met. And what we're seeing, as you've alluded to, people are working multiple jobs and still not making it. We've got a rent crisis in this country. Rent is increasing faster than people's wages. It's pretty startling. I think it's something like 40% of homeless in this country are working homeless. They've actually got jobs. They're living in their cars. And it's just, again, this is where we need political action. And we need, and this goes back to the Democrats too. It always seems as though they're afraid to even possibly upset Republicans. They're always trying to get Republican support. They're never going to get it. And yet it's like, why don't you just do something? Why don't you just, Republicans have no fear when it comes to the things that they say. And I just wish Democrats would be more willing to push back and come out and say, no, for instance, the tough on crime stance, Joe Biden and the whole defund the police type issue, right? The response from the Democrats, rather than say, hey, this is what defund the police means. It means reallocating resources. It means addressing some of the causal roots of crime. They're reactive because like, oh, we don't want to be painted as anti-law enforcement, anti-law and order. And so they go and they create this narrative like, no, look at us. We are strong law and order. And they don't, again, address that structural problem. And again, that's part of the narrative. And I suppose, too, that might be what you said earlier. They're reacting to the most extremist voices on social media. And yeah, social media, and there's also a lot of psychological studies that show the impact of social media on the human brain and human behavior. I've never understood why people would use like Facebook to get their news, but something like over 50% of the population gets their news from Facebook.
That percentage is going up and not down. Yeah.
And
that's bad.
Why do you think that is? Is it just more convenience, or is it, some of it has to do with the trust factor. If somebody that you're friends with tweets something or forwards you something, I suppose that you're more likely to believe that, but there's got to be more to it than that.
I think it's just that the platforms are maturing. Facebook and Google, and Amazon, they have the most data on humans that anyone's ever had.
Yeah.
And so, each day they get another terabyte on us. And so then they tweak the algorithms and they tweak the website to what proves to keep our attention, get our clicks, and have us part with our money. I think it's as simple as that. They're just getting better. Talk to my best friend is addicted to TikTok. And I think you might know someone who is maybe our age, my 40s, like an adult, full adult, in the prime of their life. And they're addicted to TikTok. They're just watching videos all day. I know lots of people like this. It's because these platforms are really good. They've gotten better and they will continue to get better. And this is the way it goes. And so people spend more time on these things than before. And of course, the news is going to be presented on these platforms in a really exciting way, better than CNN or MSNBC could ever dream of. So I think that's what it is.
Well, and so when you talk about regulating social media, one of the things that I think that this might be part of what you're talking about, is there is a vast amount of information that is in the hands of a relative few. A very few corporations that have all of this information on us, and the way that they use that is quite dangerous. The algorithms, I think, are a huge problem. I think the algorithms are designed to manipulate people and to get them to engage in certain activities, to stay on the site or to continue to the next whatever. That kind of begs the question, should these companies exist? I mean, should social media become more like a public utility? I mean, is it wise to allow this type of platform to exist in corporate hands?
No, it's not. They should be utility 1,000 times yes. Facebook and social media are now the default public square.
Yeah.
Public squares have been talked about in our founding documents. Like, this is a pillar of our democracy, and it's being run by Mark Zuckerberg. Probably has autism, and he doesn't care. He doesn't feel the empathy that we want him to feel. And yeah, they're being manipulated to addict us. I mean, if you watch The Social Dilemma, the Netflix documentary by Tristan Harris, I mean, that was a very impactful film, and I think it hit the nail on the head. And it just, like, it blows my mind that there's not more energy behind this. And I believe cynically that the Republican Party doesn't necessarily understand the internet super well, but they do understand that it's a on balance, it's a boon for them, that it's an asset and not a liability. That there's a website that has the top 10 stories shared on Facebook every day, and 8 out of the 10 are always some right-wing story. And so those are getting circulated voraciously. And though, random Republican in California is not necessarily a right-winger, he or she benefits from that. So that's where we are, and it's getting worse. I mean, the platforms are doing things. I don't want to be so apocalyptic. They are taking some steps, and Facebook has these silly commercials out there that are trying to kind of wipe clean their reputation. And I do believe that they are doing things, but they're not doing enough to protect our democracy. Like, this is way too important. This is way too important.
And that's where I push back the most too, where it comes to, I do not want these companies to be the moderators of speech. I do not trust them to do that. I think again, for them, it's all about the profits, right? I think that it's easier to go after the low-hanging fruit, and I mean, even if, let's say that you say that you were to agree that kicking Donald Trump off Twitter was the right thing to do, when you look at when that was done and how much, the process, I mean, the double standard was really just shocking. Anyone else, in fact, there was somebody, a private citizen, who set up an account who basically just treated word for word everything that Donald Trump treated. That account was suspended and closed. And all it was an account that was set up just to mimic Donald Trump's account. Mm-hmm. And it shows you sort of this double standard. And that's quite scary, because it shows that if you're in a position of power, or if you're generating the platform, a huge audience and revenue, there's going to be preferential treatment.
Yeah, that's the way our societies have always run, unfortunately. I'm reading a book right now called The Anti-Oligarchy Constitution by 2 scholars. I forget where they teach. One's at Oxford, I know that. And if you've read Jill Lepore's These Truths, that book examines the issue of the uneasy issue of slavery and the degradation of people of color in our country from its founding, that it doesn't seem to mesh at all with our values, and sort of how each generation kind of contended with it. The book I'm reading now is the question of whether our Constitution mandates that our government provide like an equally comfortable life to everybody, which is like an insane idea. And most people will stand up and yell socialism as if that's the worst thing that could ever happen. But this was a real debate that people had 100 years ago, and it's a thing that a lot of people believed. And I don't know, if you read the Constitution a certain way, it certainly looks that way. Like someone living in the street or in their car, like, would our society be better if the government helped them? I would say yes.
Yes, I
And
would agree.
does a reading of our founding documents sort of insinuate that there is a mandate and to do that? And I would also say yes to that too. So this exists, but just it's not in the culture. It's not in our conversation
Right.
right now. It needs to be.
Right. And even if it didn't, you see, the problem that I have with this whole with constitutional arguments in general is, okay, I don't know that we need to be forever bound by a document created hundreds of years ago by people that were in a different, sociocultural realm. Things evolve and things need to expand, and it just seems just like when it comes to the Second Amendment. I doubt very seriously the founding fathers would be okay with the type of assault, right. I mean, there are people that literally argue that the Second Amendment gives them the right to own nuclear weapons or bombs.
Yeah.
They literally believe this. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that the founding fathers would probably disagree with that. And the framing of some of the things in the Constitution are very vague as well. I mean, the right to bear arms for a well-regulated militia. I mean, that's open to interpretation. What does that mean? What do they mean by that? And we can look at different historical documents and try to infer that. But again, ultimately, it comes down to the power of the Supreme Court. And that's another thing that I think we need to reform. And I have no idea how we would do. I mean, it should not be the ideological pedestal that it is.
Yeah, I would love to see reform there too. Doesn't seem to be working. I mean, their views are drastically out of line with the consensus in the United States. Every survey shows that. And should it be? I mean, no, it's not supposed to work that way. It doesn't matter what they think. They represent us. They serve at the pleasure of us. The government is us. And so, I mean, fixing that is above my pay grade. I remember Pete Buttigieg had some pretty aggressive and assertive ideas around that. Some of them sounded pretty good to me. Those conversations don't seem to be on the table at the moment. They're probably too incendiary, and I understand the sensitivities around that. But I mean, day by day, we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, no, we need to get over these sensitivities, and we need to be able to have these conversations, discussions. And yeah, there's going to be these reactive elements that's going to say socialism as if that's some evil mechanism. We're not. It's almost like we're not allowed to have a lot of these conversations. It's like the ruling class likes the status quo, and there's a lot of power over the manipulative efforts to, sustain the status quo. And it's going to take people to break out of their shell and to break out of their comfort zone to be able to have these conversations. And we have to get past this tribalism. Everybody wants to exist in an echo chamber, it seems, and social media does provide, and same thing with the mainstream media too for that. I mean, Fox News is more of an extreme example, but the news should not be partisan. Neither should science or truth, but here we are. So yeah, I think that I agree on the social media is that part of the problem is the companies that control it and the algorithms that are designed and literally engineered to drive people's behavior. I don't think people understand that they're being manipulated at a very sophisticated level.
Yep,
and again, that just brings the question, how do we bring that awareness? Oddly enough, social media is one way to do that, but
yeah.
Yeah,
log on to Facebook to find out how much Facebook is warping your reality.
Yeah,
it really is. It's warping everyone's reality. And when we see things like January 6th, we see these clownish people who are just like irredeemably just taken by this online cult of propaganda, thinking that it's real, that Trump actually won. I mean, it's wild. And we see the guy with the thing on his head, with the pelt on his head. And then this is the profile that we have of these people. And so we need to remember two things, like that they're hurting. Like they're really hurting.
Exactly.
People, and we should really care about that.
Yes.
And the other thing we need to know is that they're not the only ones having their realities warped by the internet. And you can be a moderate and not even be political And what you think about your fellow man or what's going on the other side of your city can be completely wrong just because you've read it 1,000 times on Facebook.
Right. No, I 100% agree. I see the January 6th, those individuals as victims, right? And if we're going to be holding anybody accountable, we should be going to the very top. I mean, these people that showed up there literally believed, I have no question that they believe what they believe, that the election was stolen. But the questions were, where did they get that idea from? And that was through very manipulative efforts, outright deception. And yet it seems as though none of those people in power are being held accountable. Again, it's like they're going after the low-hanging fruit. I mean, these people were victims, and they are victims. And the idea that we should demonize people because they voted for Trump, I say we should understand why they voted for Trump. And there are some people that are there are racist elements, and there are, but I don't believe that all people that voted for Donald Trump are racist and irredeemable and immoral and all the stuff that we hear. And I think that we have to get out of that. That's where the left needs to stop and say, no, we need to understand. I mean, we share a lot with these people. And again, a lot of people that voted for Trump, well, maybe not a lot, but a good number of them were on Team Bernie Sanders. And then, some of it was just rebellion, and then some of it was just Donald Trump. Donald Trump kind of was the Bernie Sanders of the right, in a sense, in that he identified people's pain and suffering and exploited that. Which is odd, considering
how different they are in every other respect. Yeah.
But, and I think that's what people want, someone to acknowledge their suffering, to acknowledge that they've been, victimized, and kind of be a champion for them. And Donald Trump provided that. I'm not against I didn't particularly love Donald Trump doing it, but the whole idea of having these rallies that he did, even after he got elected, I think it's important for our leaders to engage with the public, rather than just get elected and all of a sudden just stay off the scene until the next campaign comes around. I think we need to have a lot more open forums with our politicians. They need to be held accountable to the people. And in order for that to happen, they need to actually engage with the people. I'd be curious too, how much does AOC continue to do that? Because she was really good at that at first too. And I know the pandemic probably has impeded some of this, but a lot of the things that Donald Trump did should be a playbook. Just because his justifications and morals were failing doesn't mean, of issues with the people.
Yeah. So Donald Trump had an unfair advantage.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So he goes out and he's rallying people against an enemy, which is either Democrats, the radical left, or the press, or pick your poison. And that really charges us up. If Biden were to do one of these rallies, it wouldn't be like that.
Right.
And
well, I'm not sure many people would show up to hear Biden, but
yeah, I agree. I agree. Biden is, unfortunately, he's an exceptionally bad communicator for the internet age. And if I was on his communications team, I'd be making a lot different decisions than are made right now. A lot of people believe he's got a lot of empathy and that he connects with people on a certain level, especially people who are hurting. And I guess I believe that in a sort of interpersonal way, but I don't think it translates well to television or the internet. The Democratic Party does have a lot of great communicators, and we should be elevating the next generation anyway.
Right.
Biden is a great man. He's served his country, but media savvy has never, ever been more important than it is now. And AOC is one of the great ones. She's 10 years younger than I am, and I follow her on Instagram. And when she videos herself, it's really compelling. It's really compelling. She has too much text. People don't like lots of text. that's one thing I would change with her. But yeah, we have a gerontocracy running the Democratic Party, so they're by default not doing the digital media marketing well. But another generation is coming up. There are a lot of people who know this stuff a lot better, and I hope that a few of the stories that I have in my book, that they sort of get more traction and people understand the stuff. There is a way. The fact that Donald Trump and the MAGA movement and the GOP in general have a slight advantage, like an unfair advantage over the Democrats, means the Democrats need to be way more diligent and message savvy. We just have to follow the rules more, and we have to stick together more. That's what it demands from us, or we're just going to get swamped every time, because learning about the crazy thing that Bernie Sanders said is way more explosive and exciting than some policy that somebody, wants to do. It's just the way it is. It's the way it's going to be.
Well, let me ask you, are Republicans winning the messaging war?
Well, it depends on how you mean. As Democrats, we run the White House, both houses of Congress. So in a way, I mean, we've won those elections, so that's good. If we're talking about policies to sort of fix the country,
Or like the cultural dialogue?
Cultural dialogue. Well, there's also nuance there, right? Let me give an example of like how I'm thinking about this. I have a very beloved person in my family who is a never Trump Republican, and her and I talk about politics a lot. And I find that her and I agree on politics, like actual policies. When there's too much money in politics, we're not funding education correctly. Every policy you could imagine, her and I completely agree. She will never vote for a Democrat. So in a way, she's voting for a culture. She's voting for an affectation, a tribal sort of familiarity that she gets when Republicans talk, or when she thinks of the Republican Party or thinks of Republicans versus Democrats. When she thinks of Democrats, she hates them. She thinks they're dumb, that they're elitist, that they're indignant, that they look down on her. In that sense, we are absolutely losing the messaging war.
Yeah, and again, that does come into the tribalism. I want to ask you too. It seems more and more that the Republican Party is embracing a form of Christian nationalism. That is incredibly dangerous, and I'm sure with your experience in the Middle East, you would agree. How big of a threat is that? It's easy for me to say, hey, that seems to represent the majority of the Republican base. Is that what you're finding? Do you find that a lot of Republicans are leaning towards a Christian nationalist approach? Is that kind of the cultural realm that they exist in now?
No, I wouldn't say that it goes that direction. I would say it goes the other direction. I would
Really?
say, yeah, just Christians feel like they're hemmed in by the Republican sort of ecosystem. I don't I don't know of Republicans who were not Christian before becoming Christian or becoming more Christian. Again, don't quote me on that. That's not a body of research that I'm doing myself. I could be totally wrong, and maybe tomorrow a study comes out. Um, what I know from my work is that religion is an incredibly powerful galvanizer
Yeah.
vis-a-vis politics, and not just sort of horse race politics where getting people elected. It obviously like drew 40,000 people to ISIS to go leave their homes, sometimes in Paris, France, and go live in a dusty, impoverished war zone in Syria where they might die, and where they have to go to the bathroom outside. Um, and a lot of those people weren't religious before. Their families were religious. They didn't go to mosque, but they got radicalized online. And the thing that radicalized them was the telling of a story. It was a narrative, and it was like a very simple good versus evil. They are evil. Look how evil they are. You are good because you're against them, and you believe this and you believe that. If you come, you can fight them. You can be on TV, put you on YouTube. We'll give you a hero's, funeral. And if your life sucks enough, that starts to sound really good. And a lot of people converted not only to Islam, but they converted to like radical Islam. It started to be this orienting principle that they use to explain all the entire world. And when you hear right-wing media, you hear the same thing. The entire world is very easily and simply explained
Right.
by this whole narrative that Trump is my president, Jesus is my Messiah, and that liberals are out there trying to tear down Christian institutions and Christian life and every Christian who wants to live in a nuclear family and all that kind of stuff. And so it's, to me, it's the exact same concept.
When you worked at the CIA and was involved in this, how quickly does it take? How much time does it take to radicalize somebody?
Oh, good question. I've never heard that before. Um, I've heard of a year. I mean, I remember like anecdotally when these travelers were arrested and interviewed sort of on their way to Turkey, and then we would get the number in my head is like 1 year. But
Wow.
I also remember anecdotes that parents would say, my son or daughter discovered YouTube, 3 months ago, and then they were gone. So I don't have the numbers like I would like, but I'm guessing some more good research is going to come out about that kind of stuff.
Who's most susceptible to that kind of programming, would you think? Young people, I imagine?
Young people, yeah, and we saw that with ISIS. Most travelers were in their 20s. But look at January 6th. I mean, the Washington Post did incredible work on those guys and gals, and many of the average age was like 50, right? And so I think this speaks to the thing that you keep bringing up, which is totally right. It's who is sort of most vulnerable and for what reason. 22-year-old Muslims living in Europe were in a really bad spot because they saw other Europeans living an amazing life all around them that they couldn't have because they couldn't get a job through discrimination or not understanding the process of how to get a job. They go back to their families want them to get a job so that they can get a wife and have kids and support the kids and build a family. Now, not only does their society not respect them, but their families don't respect them. So they
Right.
were a particularly vulnerable group. Now let's take it over to the United States. If you're 50, the economy crashed when you were in your 30s. That's when you were getting your career going. And maybe at that point, the executives above you, they sort of put a larger and larger distance between you and the reins of power in that company. And so maybe you became a VP, but you could never get in the C-suite. I think that happened to a lot of people. And what also happened is that factories closed all over the Midwest. I mean, the Rust Belt is called that for a reason. Um, you were working in a factory in your 30s and 40s, and maybe you were a manager, you were a shift leader, and suddenly your entire livelihood is gone. It gets shipped to Mexico, or it gets filled with a bunch of robots that are doing the job you
Yeah.
used to do. This means that 50 years old, 45, 55, 60, this is a vulnerable demographic in the United States for wild economic and cultural reasons. And so they were the ones that responded to this propaganda the most. And now we have QAnon and we have January 6th.
Yeah. So, I mean, really, this vulnerability then, I mean, everybody is potentially vulnerable to being radicalized, which is kind of a scary thing to think of. Would you say that it's overall easy? Well, let me ask you two questions. Would you say that it's a very easy process to radicalize someone? And on the counter end of that, how difficult is it to deprogram somebody once they've been radicalized?
Mm-hmm. I think deprogramming is extremely hard. And you can do interventions, and usually the first intervention is not going to work. But if you stick with it, you can. But I have some dear friends from college and from my younger years who I've recently gotten back in touch with, and to my eye, are full-on conspiracy theorists, and I know I'm not the only one who's had this experience. They weren't they weren't talking crazy back when we were hanging out all the time, and now they are. And they talk as if they think Twitter is the real world. They talk as if everything that they don't understand is automatically kind of evil and conspiring against them and everybody like them. And, I was as empathetic and as open to listening as I could possibly be. And I listened for hours and hours and hours, and I didn't see a spot where I could break this up. And I presented some countervailing evidence. And instead of a well-crafted response that made sense, it was much more of a flood. It was a
Right.
lot of sort of like bumper stickers and taglines that maybe you would see on the Chiron if watching Fox News, or at the top of Breitbart. It was just a lot of those, what about this? What about this? And it was never sort of pulling something apart to show me the innards of why they believe what they believe and why they don't believe what I just said. I think it's incredibly hard. And there are modalities, there are ways to do this. Stephen Hassan, he's one of the big guys who are doing this. He was in a cult himself, a Korean cult. I forget the name of it, in the 1970s. So he was pulled out of the cult by his family, who did multiple interventions on him, and he finally came out. And he's got a method to pull people out of this conspiracy theories and radicalization. I think it's extremely hard, but to your point, which I love, it starts with sort of how these people view their life. Like, is it bad or good compared to whoever is around them? And if you can convince them that it is good and it can be better by not believing this and sort of staying focused on, just give them a chance to live a
Right.
respectable life, I think it has a lot of traction.
And I would say too that probably one of the, I mean, we're all human. We don't like necessarily to admit that we're wrong. There's probably a lot of shame involved in people. I mean, it's easier to sort of, and also there's that community you have that, when we're talking about the Trump MAGA community. I mean, there's a whole community there, and a lot of these people have cut off relationships with others, and so there's that loneliness, disconnect aspect. There's shame. There's no one likes to admit that they've been taken advantage of, or that they've been fooled. So there's a lot of these psychological elements too, I imagine, that sort of people just, it's easier to stay in the group than leave it. And so, as you say, this is where we need to be very empathetic, understanding. I always tell people, facts are great, but facts don't change people. Facts, one of the things that I thought Donald Trump was very prescient in a lot, like when he said alternative facts. Now, what he meant was completely ludicrous. However, he sociologically, he was right on point. Facts are whatever people, the word facts and truth, just because I say something is a fact or truth, that doesn't make it so. A lot of it is people's perceptions, how people perceive information. And so, and I think that Donald Trump, there's a brilliance there in terms of marketing, self-promotion, and manipulation. Say what you want about Trump, but he is very, very well attuned with that. And unfortunately, as we've seen, that's quite scary. But he understands that truth is whatever you want to make it. And, the left going after these people and saying, oh, well, they're stupid. Oh, look at, just like with repeating facts, that's just further going to push them away. But there is that human response. I mean, empathy seems to be becoming more and more of this distant part of our human nature. Have you had, I mean, what approaches have you found that are at least somewhat successful in expressing that empathy to people?
Well, just common courtesy is a big thing. For me, actually, what's maybe even more important than the interaction with the other person is this sort of self work that you do with yourself, because having empathy for someone who believes things that you see are vile or immoral is really hard, and it's really hard for everybody. And so in my book I write that belief, like the word belief, doesn't really mean what we all sort of use it to mean. When we say someone believes something, we're sort of assuming that they have, through the best of their ability, done like a calculation on its level of truth and how it like, sort of like stands up to scrutiny or to questioning in the wider world and from somewhere outside of my own brain. And that's not what it means pretty much most of the time. If you want to refer to scholars and researchers, there's a better argument to be made there. But for the most part, believing something is much more what we stand to gain by believing it and by signaling to others that we believe it. All right. So I mean, if you look at January 6th or QAnon, or take your pick, your right wing militia, these guys and gals are getting this amazing feeling of camaraderie that they didn't have before. They're finding all these
Yeah.
other right wingers on the internet. That is intensely powerful, especially for someone who doesn't like their life and maybe is estranged from their family, and maybe their wife left them and their job sucks. I mean, all this stuff. When you are a part of an online army, it's sort of a synthetic or adulterated sort of community, but it is a community. If it's the best you can find, and that's what you're going to glom onto. But it's not just them; it's us too. I mean, I
Yeah,
believe I believe
absolutely.
that I'm smart, smarter than the average bear. But I've never been inside the brain of anybody else. I can't confirm that. But by believing that, it gives me confidence to speak with authority or to engage with somebody who's got authority over me, or to convince somebody that I have confidence in myself and maybe I'm attractive enough to be a friend or be something else. I mean, this is like the currency with which we kind of run our interpersonal relationships, and it's
Yeah.
all based on what we stand to gain by believing what we believe. And no one is immune to this. Not me, not you, not anybody listening. And that is going to be a big key to harnessing the empathy that we need to deal with the other side in a much more non-pathological way.
Right, and there's a treatise, the sociological imagination, that really speaks to this, and that reality is a social construct. Um, we're not in the real world; we're creating the real world as we perceive it, and there's evolutionary roots to that. So yeah, absolutely. I think self-work and acknowledging. I mean, it's quite startling to realize that we're not seeing reality, the absolute reality, that everything is a social construct.
Mm-hmm.
We don't choose where we live. I mean, how the culture, the religion, all of these different aspects of our lives from birth onward shapes how we perceive and interact with reality,
Mm-hmm.
and it can be very, very difficult to break free from that hold that it has on you,
Mm-hmm.
and especially when it comes to reaching across the aisle. So absolutely, we're running out of time, but I want to ask you quickly. So, you I'd love to have you back when your book comes out.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a title for the book yet?
The working title right now is called Moral Imagination.
Oh, I love it.
Thank you.
I love that title. That goes right along with what I just said, the sociological imagination.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll see if
Wow.
the publishers like it. So
Oh well, you got to push them
TBD.
on that. That's a perfect title.
Oh, thank you.
And again, no idea when it might be coming out, when it might be finished.
No, I don't. Manuscript is about halfway done, so I'm still in sort of early phases, but hopefully into the fall we'll start to get a better timeline.
Well, I wish you the best of luck with that, and please again come back. I'd love to promote that and talk to you more about it. I'd love to read the book, by the way.
All right.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add that we didn't cover, or that maybe you'd want to last words?
Oh man, just love each other. Empathy is the thing that's going to save us. Empathy
Absolutely.
and deep understanding about the problems that we have right now. And the internet is just this thing that got dropped on us and is changing everything, but it's not really allowing us to see how much it's changing us. That is the truth. So
Yes.
knowing ourselves and knowing the internet and knowing politics, those three things. And Sean, you are doing a great thing by instigating these conversations and talking about like really deep stuff. This isn't happening in as many places as it should. And I want to commend you on doing this great show. I would love to be back when the book comes out, and you're an angel for suggesting so.
Thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in, everyone. We'll be back next Tuesday at 2 o'clock. I want to thank my guest. Please, he's going to come back when he has his book. And where can people find you on social media?
I'm on Twitter. I don't tweet very much unless something happens in Russia or Ukraine that sort of gets a bee in my bonnet. But I'm at Brent Giannotta, which is BrentGiannotta on Twitter.
Great. Thank you so much again for joining us. Everybody, we'll see you next week. This has been Coup Save America.